Thank you so much. Thank you, Lisa. And I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us today, but also to thank those of you who are behind the scenes, our team at Texas Global, including Lisa Anaya and Thuy Nguyen, for all of their work. We would not be here together had they not worked so diligently. We're also really immensely grateful to our colleagues in the Texas X's, and we'll hear from our colleague at the Texas X's in a few minutes. My name is Sonia Feigenbaum, and I'm the Senior Vice Provost for Global Engagement and Chief International Officer here at the University of Texas at Austin. And I want to welcome you and say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're calling from or zooming in from. I know that we have about 20 countries represented and that many of you are here as a result of conversations we've had in the past regarding the many ways in which we can engage with our alumni here in the US and abroad. So today I'm delighted that so many of you are joining us. We're going to have a very interesting conversation on energy, renewable energy, clean and green, and really think about our future in terms of sustainability. As Lisa mentioned, please say hi in the chat box, introduce yourselves, let us know where you're from. And before we start, I'd like to talk a little bit about Texas Global. Today, we're really excited because it's the kickoff of the International Education Week, which is an initiative that is co-sponsored by the US Department of State and the US Department of Education, where institutions across the nation celebrate internationalization and really speak to the value and the importance of global engagement at universities. And so this is our kickoff event for Texas Global, but more importantly, Texas Global is the organization or the engine that supports, leads internationalization, engages with our stakeholders across campus, as well as our international partners, and ensures that we really uphold and lift up our faculty in the research that they do and in the successes that they have, as well as, of course, encourage our students to be global citizens and participate in a variety of activities that include study abroad, internships, and so forth abroad. But Texas Global Dialogues today is our third Texas Global Dialogue, and the first one really focused on journalism in Latin America. The second one was on artificial intelligence, and the third one is, as you know, on renewable energies. And we identified sort of a gap in terms of our engagement with our alumni that are all over the world with regards to engaging with them from an academic perspective. So we were planning on having these types of events in person, in country, in various regions, and then the pandemic impacted us. And so we've decided that it would be best for us to work together with the Texas X's and have a virtual platform prior to launching in person in the months to come. We had several conversations with our stakeholders here on campus, as well as the Texas X's, and we decided that really the best course of action was to create programming that would really highlight the academic enterprise of UT Austin. So with that, I would like to welcome Kim Gunderson. She's the Associate Executive Director of the Texas X's, and she's going to give a few words. Kim?
Thank you, Sonia. Very thrilled to be here today. As you mentioned, there are over 500,000 alumni of UT Austin living all around the world, and we keep them connected to each other and to the university. We've been doing this for more than 135 years and have evolved from small gatherings of Longhorns in local communities to just a few months ago, launching a worldwide networking platform called Hooked In, and now, of course, partnering with Texas Global on this exciting initiative. I want to welcome our audience and our panelists of experts to this important conversation today. When Sonia first brought this idea of collaborating on Texas Global Dialogues, we immediately saw the value and the need for something like this. Both Texas Global and Texas X's are committed to engaging in a more deliberate way with our alumni all across the world. And although we're unable to travel to visit with alumni where they live, at least at the moment, we're so thankful to be able to bring the university to you wherever you are. Today's conversation will give us plenty of food for thought, and I'm eager to hear from our panelists. I want to thank you all again for joining us today.
Thank you, Kim. Let's start with our conversation. But before we do, we're going to have a couple of polls that I'll share in a few minutes. And perhaps many of you may be aware that UT has over 350 energy researchers in schools, departments, and centers across campus. They're engaged in groundbreaking research across the energy spectrum, and they've contributed to innovation and progress in clean energy. So we're very much poised as an institution to leverage our research and understanding of technology and see how they converge to address a variety of issues, to contribute to multiple perspectives, and to offer solutions for clean energy. So I think we're going to be putting up a couple of polls. The first one, quite frankly, is I'm really curious about the various perceptions that are represented with our audience. Regarding the plethora of energy sources that are available in the world. And I'd like to also have a better understanding of the different forms of energy that you're aware of. So let's see, here's the first poll. And our first poll states, which energy source do you believe has the most global growth today? It's a little bit of a trick question, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. We're all curious to hear your thoughts with our distinguished speakers. Our second poll is one that actually is going to lead us to the conversation and to introducing our first speaker. And it has to do with geothermal energy. When you're thinking of geothermal, what do you think of? What comes to mind? Iceland, heat pumps, volcanoes, energy, or you could really simply ask, what is geothermal? And I think that we're going to put some of the responses in the Q&A just for us to be aware of how you've responded. But right now, I'd like for our speakers to give a brief introduction of their work and their research before we move to a more of a Q&A conversation. So fascinating. We have Iceland as being one of the top choices of geothermal, pertinent to geothermal, as well as heat pumps, and then energy. So that leads us, I think, very well into the introduction from Dr. Jamie Beard. Dr. Jamie Beard is the executive director of the Geothermal Entrepreneurship organization in the Cockrell School of Engineering. So Jamie, if you don't mind introducing yourself, that would be great.
Hey everybody, I'm Jamie. I actually appreciate being called a doctor, but I'm actually an Esquire. I'm an attorney and an energy and regulatory attorney by training. And I am a lifelong proponent of geothermal energy as the baseload clean energy solution for the world. Currently, I run an organization at UT called GEO. It stands for the Geothermal Entrepreneurship Organization. It's a Department of Energy funded entity that seeks to engage the state of Texas, the oil and gas industry, and UT faculty and researchers that are working on oil and gas problems, engage them in the problems and challenges associated with scalable geothermal energy.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to our second speaker. Next, we have Dr. Varun Rai. He's the director of the Energy Institute and Associate Dean for Research and a professor of Public Affairs in the LBJ School of Public Affairs. He's also an associate professor of mechanical engineering in the Cockrell School of Engineering. Varun,
Great.
go ahead.
Thank you so much, Sonia, and welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Varun Rai. I am at the LBJ School of Policy and also at the Cockrell School of Engineering, and I'm director of the Energy Institute. This university, when 10 years ago I chose to came here, I had, other options, but energy and the leadership of energy research at UT is, really phenomenal. And so that was a decision I made. And 10 years looking down the road, it was absolutely fabulous because, as Sonia mentioned, over 350 faculty and researchers conduct energy-related research, and there are over 30 centers that really work on different aspects of energy. So as director of the Energy Institute, I have the great honor and pleasure of really bringing together researchers from different disciplines, departments, and setting them on ever greater ideas and challenges. And in my role as a professor, I work on studying emergence of patterns in the adoption of energy technologies and using those insights to devise policies that address barriers in adoption of clean energy technologies. So, how can we accelerate adoption? And, Sonia mentioned the theme of today's talk, this discussion, clean and green energy. How do we go from here to net zero carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in 3 decades at such a fast scale and rapidity? So, it includes social, economic, behavioral, policy, as well as technological aspects. And I try to, it's very, it's not obvious, but I try to, in my research, bring all of those aspects. So I look forward to the conversation. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you so much, Varun. And now we are going to speak to Dr. Michael Weber. He's the Chief Science and Technology Officer at ENGIE. And he's also a professor of mechanical engineering in the Cockrell School of Engineering. Michael, go ahead.
That's great. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation. So as you heard, I actually have some global role in that I'm based in Paris, France, as a Chief Science and Technology Officer at ENGIE. This is one of the world's largest energy companies headquartered in Paris. It has about 170,000 employees in 70 countries, and we generate a lot of electricity, we move gas, and we implement services like energy efficiency. I run the Research and Innovation Programs, which is a group of a few hundred people, say 350 people, and a budget of across the entire company, about $200 million a year, looking at innovation around clean energy. And I'm also a professor at the University of Texas in mechanical engineering, where I teach classes like thermodynamics, as well as energy technology and policy and entrepreneurship. And I do research on energy systems, and I collaborate with Varun Rai and Jamie Beard and others on campus, because UT, as you heard, is one of the world leaders in energy, and there's a lot of expertise in a lot of different corners of campus. So no matter the energy problem, we have someone on campus who knows something, and that makes it a great place to find collaborators for research. So really pleased to have this opportunity. And I'll say one more thing. I grew up on campus because my father was a professor in chemistry. So I grew up at UT, and then I went to UT as an undergrad. And while I was a student, before I was a student, and while my father was a professor, he took 2 sabbaticals. So I lived in Switzerland and Paris as a kid. So I had a little bit of international experience along the way as a soon-to-be Longhorn, we'll say it that way. But thanks again for having me as part of this conversation.
Thank you so much. Indeed, I think all of you have tremendous global experience, not just because of your personal experiences living abroad, but also because of the field that you're in. And so I'd like to ask a question that's open to all of you, really. You're all focusing on different aspects of renewable and sustainable energy. And we know that various countries have different approaches. For example, if we think about France and their relationship to nuclear energy, as opposed to, for example, Germany and their relationship to nuclear energy, I'm really curious if we're looking at it from the standpoint of Texas, which is a state that's known for its extraction of petroleum, and Jamie will talk about other extractions of energy. Which of these sources do you consider to be the most promising sources of sustainable energy?
For Texas? Oh, yay! I think for that.
Yes.
So I bet you that Varun and Michael will say we'll have a more diverse opinion than I on this. but when it comes to Texas, Texas is the global leader and brain trust of, you know, the oil and gas industry, right? And so when you look at trying to leverage all of that expertise and that huge workforce and the entire oil and gas industry at large, you know, let's think of ways to use drilling to solve, you know, clean energy problems. And that positions geothermal, you know, squarely in the center of Texas being able to get out in front of and lead a clean energy revolution really over the next decade by leveraging what it already knows and all of the state's current expertise in drilling. So, you know, and just to back up for folks in the poll that actually said, what's geothermal? I was shocked to see 30% of people responded energy, because that's actually an outlier. Most folks, when they think of geothermal, they think of Iceland, and they think of it as a very niche type of small opportunity. But, you know, anywhere in the world, if these 76 participants that we have here, you know, anywhere that you're standing, if you drill far enough, you reach temperatures that are, you know, perfectly suitable to build a geothermal power plant, right? And it's all about leveraging drilling expertise to get to it. So it's geothermal is a global opportunity that will be enabled by the oil and gas industry.
So what would you say, Jamie, to those individuals who hear the word drilling and don't really have any knowledge of the field, and they are bombarded with the media that speaks to all of the negative aspects of drilling when they're thinking of fracking and things of the sort?
Yeah.
How would you educate individuals who are not aware of the nuances? And how do you know long-term what the effects of drilling are going to be on our environment?
For geothermal. So that is, it's interesting when people, and this would be actually a different poll, but when people think of geothermal, they don't think of negative things largely. They think of this clean, green, really exceptional energy resource. But the fact of the matter is, the way geothermal is developed is identical to the way oil and gas is developed, right? So really, when people associate negative thoughts with drilling and fracking and these things, the typical reason for that is it's associated with hydrocarbons. So it's the association with oil and gas. But if you use the same technologies to harvest, you know, 24/7 clean energy globally, people's outlook and their opinions about using those technologies change, right? Because you're doing it for green and clean energy. So you know, there does need to be a bit of education when it comes to public education, but also policymakers and governments about geothermal energy and how we harvest it and how we can harvest it globally, because there are some, you know, technology challenges and such. But you know, essentially the oil and gas and the geothermal industries are the same industry. You know, you explore for, you drill for, and you produce energy. In the case of oil and gas, it's hydrocarbons. In the case of geothermal, it's heat. But it's essentially the same business, right? And so that where the nuances are and where the really interesting questions rise to the fore, I think, is when the oil and gas industry pivots, right, and decides, well, we're just going to do this. We're going to drill for heat. We're going to green drill. Let's go and do it. Let's have a green drilling boom. When that does happen, I think there's going to be some interesting dynamics in, you know, for instance, for environmental groups and their willingness to embrace the oil and gas industry with this new green purpose, right? But it's still drilling. So we'll see. There's a lot of interesting questions, I think, that we'll be stepping through in the next 5 or 10 years.
Just to put a global number on it, my numbers are not exact, so don't get angry at me if I'm a little bit off, but the point is correct, which is over history, over the last 150 years or so, something like 5 million oil and gas wells have been drilled, and about 1 million of those have been drilled in Texas. So Texas is a global scale location in terms of putting holes into the ground. Not all of those are active, so maybe half of those are active today, half of them are done with and need to be plugged or have been plugged and that kind of thing. But we just have a lot of experience drilling holes in the ground to extract oil and gas and other things, including water in many cases, or other value in extracting heat. It's just one more thing we can get from the ground.
So if I can add, Sonia, to your question in terms of Texas. So Jamie's pitch is just so powerful, right? Let's all, go in, but taking a step back, look at wind, for example, right? Just last, of course, we all know that Texas in the US is by far the leading in wind generation. California is actually third. We have a number 2 now, that's Iowa, right? And a similar story is starting to play out in terms of solar. Next 10 years, it's going to be, a big solar boom out here in Texas. But just as with geothermal, hydrogen is another area where Texas is starting to organize, and there are discussions that companies and academia and other stakeholders are starting to have. And it basically, in many ways, just as with geothermal, in many ways brings together different types of electricity generation from different sources, but then also using existing or similar new infrastructure and using it also for the industrial processes and the industrial base out in the Gulf Coast area. So, very integrated, also forward-looking, right? Just as with geothermal. So what you're seeing in Texas is almost like a microcosm. And why are we having this discussion? In the next 3 decades, we all need to go net zero emissions. And the obvious answer, the obvious silver bullet is we need all of it, right? There is no one, but we need all of it. And Texas really, truly, in many ways, is the microcosm. You are seeing all of this not play out in fantasy land, but actually happening real time here.
So that's a great point. Thanks for all bringing your perspective. It takes me to the question of, yes, so net zero emissions within 30 years, and the fact that there's this pivoting of the diversification of the portfolio as it relates to energy and renewable energy. Speak to us a little bit about costs. I mean, there are various individuals who will say, well, this isn't actually sustainable because of the population that we're serving, the amount of the population. We can't use this type of energy source, or we're better off using this energy source because of the topography in which we are. Can you speak a little? You're talking about Texas being a microcosm. I think that from a topographical and geographical perspective, it certainly I think plays into that perspective. But tell us a little bit about those individuals who say, no, you should focus on this energy source because of the cost and its relationship to population size.
And I'll say that at ENGIE, because we build and operate and own power plants and gas networks all over the world, we have a pretty good view on cost. And we are building new power plants in North America, South America, Asia, Middle East, Europe, you name it. So we're active in many places. And the most consistent low-cost option for a new power plant today around the world are wind and solar, and sometimes storage is third. So there are very clean options that are very cheap. It's actually expensive to build a coal plant in many places, especially Europe and North America. It is still cheap to build a coal plant in China, but that is becoming less true with time. So wind and solar are very cheap. They're the low-cost options with or without subsidies. We have subsidies in the United States, but those subsidies don't exist in other countries necessarily. Yet wind and solar is still the low-cost option because the technology is simple, the resource is abundant in many places, that kind of thing. So I think this notion that renewable electricity is more expensive is based on outdated data from the past, but also does not include the cost of the environmental damage or pollution. And if you include the cost of pollution, then the traditional options are more expensive than they look, especially if you include the climate challenges and damages from climate change, that kind of thing. So if you do a full cost accounting of the environmental damage, then the traditional sources look more expensive. But even without those, the newer sources like wind and solar are cheaper. And then some of the things that Jamie's working on will help bring the cost down for geothermal. Geothermal is not the cheapest option necessarily today, but it's pretty close. And geothermal has some very particular performance benefits compared to wind and solar. Wind and solar vary based on the weather or astronomical conditions like position of the earth relative to the sun or time of year, that kind of thing. Geothermal doesn't have those variabilities. So it's a great complement to what we can get from wind and solar. So I think a lot of this idea that the cleaner options are more expensive is frankly out of date.
I don't know what else to add. Michael put it so well, but something I'll say is also those damages have a very, very regressive impact. So a lot of the marginalized communities, the low-income communities, those are, and not just but even countries. Those are the places where you see most of the damages. So, looking at the full cycle perspective, and also, this is about us as society and communities moving forward. One of the things I think is extremely important as we think about this energy transition, and as we move to the next 3 to 5 decades, is we not only do it and not only in the cheapest sense, doing it cost effectively is very important. We have other priorities of health, education, and other social aspects. Energy is one of them, and it plays into many of those things. So cost effectiveness is important. Yet there are other very, very important principles, and principles that include equity and justice. And that's been really red eye in many ways for the energy system of the past, as to how we have completely sidelined and not paid much attention. So as we look to making these investments, let's pay attention to cost effectiveness. And then Michael already pointed out why those are less of a concern than really they're made out of, but also equity, justice, and regional impacts. And that's where it goes back to your question, Sonia, as to there are ideas that let's use this. There are reasons why certain types of solutions are better in certain types of geographies or locations. And that's the reason why also things like hydrogen and geothermal, and also in storage and other, we still need to continue to invest. Carbon capture and storage, right? In Texas, a big story is natural gas and its role. There are very important scenarios where natural gas can continue to be very important, but it's not obvious. And that's why continued investment in innovation and technological change remains very relevant. And so, we need to keep pushing on those as well.
I would just add really briefly to underline something Michael said on outdated thinking on cost. If you look at the cost curves for both solar and wind, I mean, it's going down really fast. And over the next 10 years, the cost of solar and wind is going to be extraordinarily cheap. So, geothermal has a longer way to go, because geothermal has kind of been this forgotten renewable, and it has not received a lot of the support and subsidy that solar and wind did over the past 2 decades. So geothermal is going to have to run really fast to catch up with solar and wind on their cost curves, which is why I'm leaning on the oil and gas industry to help make that happen, and they can. But I think when it comes to the reality versus the perception, that seems to be the real issue, because the costs are coming down very, very quickly, and and in 5 years for solar and wind, this won't even be a topic of conversation, I don't think, anymore.
Thank you. So good point. So the reality versus the perception, and the fact that the cost isn't really an issue according to the data. Now let's move that line of thinking to the political realm. So when you're thinking of the politics connected to the energy environment, I'd like to know what your thoughts are regarding policy, and how the policy is impacted by the groups that are most vociferous, and how you perceive, for example, the change in administration in the US to have an impact on not just a domestic impact, but an international impact on what happens next in the case of renewable energy. Can any of you think about that?
Some view from France. So first of all, I would say that policy is very important to energy. I think all of us believe that, although Jamie and Varun, let me know if you think I'm wrong. But Varun's a professor in the policy school for a reason, which is it's a relevant place to be, because policy is particularly relevant for the way you get permitting or financing and all sorts of things for energy. And it can even set mandates and targets and that kind of thing. So policy is very relevant. And policy occurs at many levels: city, state, and federal. The federal policy discussion of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden gets a lot of the attention, but actually what happens at the city and state level becomes very relevant, especially for some of the things Jamie's working on, which is focused on Texas, for example. So in their cities that can pass local ordinances banning diesel engines or requiring rebates for solar or whatever it is. So there's many layers of policy. The layer that gets the most attention is federal, and that's just one piece of many. The view from Paris is interesting because in France, there is not an argument about whether climate change is real. Climate change is accepted because that's what the science says. And the argument is around the policies that we need to address it. Whereas in the United States, we argue about whether it is real. It's a little bit like watching from France, Americans argue about whether gravity is real. Is gravity real or not? And then do we need policies to deal with it? Whereas in France, the argument's about what kind of policy, how quickly can we do it? What's the best way so that it doesn't cost too much or has reliability problems and that kind of thing. And so from the French perspective, having the Biden election victory is quite welcome because he has pledged to re-engage with the Paris Climate Accords and be an international collaborator on climate change. And I think the world wants America to be a collaborator on this. So from the international perspective, that will be a change and that will be a welcome change. Functionally, it doesn't really mean anything. The Paris Climate Accords are non-binding and they don't actually drive a lot of money, but they give some spiritual philosophical alignment, which is really good. So I like it that we will join Paris Climate Accords. But there's still a lot of decisions to be made that have nothing to do with Paris about what we're going to do with our tax codes and what we're going to do with carbon requirements from the federal level, much less state and others. So I think the presidential election is meaningful. It matters. It's given more attention than it really deserves because a lot of the policy action is at those lower levels.
Yeah, I think it makes sense here to mention also lobbies and what lobbies have power and are gaining power. Because they're really important in terms of getting the attention of governments and also gaining subsidy for particular industries. You know, the historical boogeyman in energy lobbying is the oil and gas lobby, right? And the oil and gas lobby is still powerful, but it's actually losing power to the solar and wind lobbies, at least in the US, which have gotten quite powerful themselves. So, and just in the case of geothermal, the geothermal industry doesn't have a lobby at all. So it's essentially a voiceless renewable energy source. So, you know, you can step back and look at this and say, and really track the activity of lobbies to policy decisions, to regulatory decisions, and to subsidy for the various renewable options. And, you know, of course, my opinion about this would be that the oil and gas lobby needs to take up geothermal because it's it's the future of the oil and gas industry, and the industry doesn't currently have a lobby. So, you know, there's a job for K Street for oil and gas, right? And it, you know, it's an already existing lobby that could shift its focus to a green purpose.
So
that's really interesting.
If I can just quickly, one lens that I find useful is, again, why are we doing this, and what is it that we're after? We're after changing large parts of the global energy system in 3 decades. That's what we are after. It means enormous scale and scales that we have seen before in the world of energy, but not the rapidity. We have not transitioned this fast at this scale before. And, you know, that's where policy really becomes important in 3 different buckets. One is, you know, there are all sorts of, subsidy and cost imbalances, right? You know, there are, technologies that are mature that are receiving subsidies and technologies that are new. And, you know, all you need to do is take them down the experience curve and, learning by doing costs come down. They need subsidies and they don't have it, right? So there are all those imbalances that policies can fix. The second area is really, we already talked about geothermal, hydrogen, CCS, all these new types of, technologies that we need to invest in, innovate, and be ready for the next phase of investments. The third one is really infrastructure, right? You know, you have to build new transmission lines, new hydrogen lines, and other types of all sorts of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and those also require lots of regulatory as well as direct policy aspects. And the fourth one I mentioned already, I think it is perhaps the most important, which is how do you, amid all of this, keep a very direct eye into equity and justice aspect, right? And there are all sorts of failures and needs for institutions and investments in local communities, and creating that require all sorts of policy action at all the levels that Michael already mentioned.
Thank you. So I have a question. You're talking about.
Can I make one more comment real quick? Sorry about that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Jamie made a comment that made me laugh because she said geothermal doesn't have a lobbying group. And I think this is very important. And this is where solar and wind were maybe 30, 40 years ago. And this reminds me of the famous anecdote from, it must have been the early 70s, some international issue came up and President Nixon said, we need to get Europe on board. And Henry Kissinger said, yeah, okay, someone get me the phone number for Europe. Which of course there isn't a phone number for Europe. There's like 35 phone numbers for Europe. And this is the challenge of geothermal, that there's a bunch of entities that are active, but there's too many phone numbers. There's not one go-to trade association or lobbying group. The way there finally is around wind and solar, the way there has been for coal, or the way there has been for oil and gas for a century. So this is one of the things that is missing. So
I'm curious to follow up on what you all said. Jamie, you're talking about the importance of geothermal and how it's crucial to pivot from oil and gas. What has your experience been with the Gulf states and how they're looking at their energy source while you're working on geothermal here in Texas and working with the lobbyists to change the perspective?
Yeah. That's an interesting one, and that's developing. So it's been a pretty cool reception from Gulf state entities, oil and gas entities, and that if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, right? Because they don't, unlike the European oil and gas entities, the European majors and the U.S. majors, the Gulf state majors have different priorities. And they're thinking more aggressively about different types of renewables, right? So they're interested more, for instance, in solar in terms of pivoting. So in terms of uptake of this idea in the oil majors, the top players are the major IOCs in Europe. They're the ones that are running the fastest. Close behind them, but a little slower, are the U.S. companies. and Gulf state is, very little engagement and not quite sure how to engage, thinking about it, but not quite sure what the angle is. And frankly, there's some work to be done there, right? And to try to figure out how, quite frankly, how the entire oil and gas industry engages with this in a way where everyone wins and everyone has a role, and not all entities will.
Thank you. Varun, Michael, any comments on that?
I'd say that if we think of like the Gulf countries, one thing that we're seeing, and we're very active there, I think we're the biggest power provider in the Middle East, is that there's an increasing demand for electricity and also increasing demand for oil and gas and domestically produced fuels. And every time these demands increase, that means there's less for export, which means less money from the rest of the world. So anything we can do to liberate some of these regions that produce oil and gas from their own consumption, they have more to export and therefore have a more sort of vibrant economy from an export perspective. So that's a challenge we see and very relevant. Then there's all the other problems of a warming world means more demand for air conditioning. In a world surrounded by salty water means more demand for energy for desalination. And so we start to think about integrated systems design that gives clean water, cooling, and electricity, while minimizing the use of domestic fuels like oil and gas that can then be exported. So we think there's opportunity to really improve how this is done.
Thank you. I have a question from one of our audience members, Harry Mueller, asks, 30 to 40 years ago, there was an attempt to access geothermal energy at some presumably satisfactory location in Texas. It was apparently unsuccessful, at least from an economic point of view. What's happened since then to make it economically more sound?
Ooh, good question. Okay, so he's likely talking about the geopressured systems along the Gulf Coast. So Texas is amazing, not only in terms of brain trust for drilling, but in terms of geothermal resources. And it's something that is entirely overlooked right now. Texas is second only in the country. I mean, and you think of geothermal, you think of the states where there's volcanoes and stuff. No, Texas is literally second in the country, having the easiest to get to, lowest hanging fruit, hot sedimentary basins for geothermal power production. And this is something that is just not on the radar currently, policymakers and government and everything else. It's a huge resource. So yes, 30, 40 years ago, they did go after the geopressured systems in tests. Geopressured systems are technically literally the most complicated thing you could try to drill, because they have enormous and unpredictable pressures depending on, and as you drill, it gets worse. And back 30, 40 years ago, we did not have the technologies to handle geopressured systems. So managed pressure drilling is one of the technology developments of the last decade that would make that a lot easier. But just putting the geopressured systems aside, they tried the hardest thing possible and they failed. But in the oil and gas industry, and the reason, the question here is really why now? And I think it's a really great question. The technological piece of that is really important for oil and gas, because over the last 15 years in oil and gas, there have been 3 separate technological flourishes, really huge technological advancements in drilling that make this idea that you can drill for geothermal anywhere in the world no longer this moonshot crazy idea, but actually incrementally doable. So maybe not super cheap now, maybe not really easy to do now, but feasible. Like, hey, if we thought about this a little bit, we could do this and we could get the cost down really fast. And that is directional drilling, frac boom stuff, so hydraulic fracturing, high pressure and temperature offshore plays that happened in the early 2000s, managed pressure drilling. All of these flourishes of technology are going to enable these really complex geothermal drilling operations. And so there really has been an enabling technological feature along with others, dynamics, social dynamics and others that make this a lot easier to sell. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you. Varun, I have a follow-up question because, and I think all of you agreed that Texas is really a microcosm to explore a variety of energy sources. Can you tell us a little bit about the how the Energy Institute differentiates itself from any other energy institute in the US? What makes it unique?
Great question, Sonia, and I'm sure I did not plant it. As we already brought up, the energy research at UT is really vast and deep. The Energy Institute serves as a glue to bring together researchers from different parts of the campus to work on critical and complex energy problems, really at scale, right? I mean, one of the things that is really I observe on a daily basis in my interactions with colleagues is this deep desire not to just do the research and do the publication, but rather connect it to an impact. And that's something that's just so special right now in the space of energy. It doesn't stop. In the scholar's mind, it doesn't stop with the paper. Rather, we are seeing the impacts play out. We are seeing the role that we can have in shaping. And so, I see that. In terms of the uniqueness, it's really the diversity of ideas and expertise that we have on campus. I mean, in all honesty, there are very few other campuses across the face of this globe that have that range of expertise. And so when we have all the way from conventional energy to new energy to potentially new energy, when we have a conversation in a room here at UT, it's not a biased conversation. It's a very, very well-balanced, very well-informed conversation where every colleague has an experience and expertise and they're willing to bring that to the table, but also they're willing to listen and understand. And that gives a certain type of power, if you will, when we design different activities and ideas and come together in teams. So I would say that this interdisciplinarity, which is just so important in addressing complex problems, is a reality of energy research at UT, and something that diversity that exists here is the basic building block for that. So I think that really distinguishes what we have here at UT.
I can give an illustration of how that is in action in my program. Actually, 2 Texas legacies aside from energy are space exploration and defense. And ultra high temperature materials and technologies are relevant in both of those areas. And so, part of the reason Texas is really interesting for everything high temperature is the convergence of 3 really important industries in that way: space, defense, and energy. And one of the startups that's coming out of Geo is actually a defense-funded faculty member in the Cockrell Electrical Engineering Department, who developed a sensor for the Department of Defense for the Air Force that can work while it's on fire. One of the major problems that geothermal drilling has right now is sensors failing at high temperatures. perfect. Let's grab him and his technology and his defense background, pull him into geothermal. And he started a company that is pursuing a high temperature technology, sensor technology for geothermal drilling. So, there's a case study. He just presented his technology to the DOE last week, and they absolutely loved it. Like, we're just so ecstatic about it. And it wasn't even on their radar, right? Because it was in defense. Who would have thought? So we've really got to pull groups together, because there's pieces of this puzzle scattered all over the place, right? And it doesn't really matter in what department. Let's look for the solution anywhere the solution lies, right? So yeah, agree. UT Austin is great for that.
Thank you. That's great to hear. I knew that, but I think it's important for us to convey that to our audience, even though most of them probably know that. But I think the diversity of opinion, especially in an academic environment, is paramount to moving us forward to solve global challenges. And to that point, I have a question from an attendee, Eric Delay, who asked about hydrogen. Is hydrogen technology being looked at as an environmental alternative for transportation? Are we doing that at UT Austin? And are there any industries or is there any kind of research that's taking place here at UT that's looking at implementing some of the solutions pertinent to transportation?
I'll give a quick answer on that. And the answer is hydrogen is very interesting for transportation, but also for industrial heat, but also for chemicals, also for power generation. And ENGIE, the company I work at in Paris, is one of the world leaders on deployment of hydrogen at scale. We have a big hydrogen facility we're building in the Netherlands. We're doing some hydrogen demonstrations at the port of Dunkirk in France. And our customers are asking for it. We're making hydrogen for off-road mining trucks in Africa. The demand for hydrogen is growing. And I would say this is something to keep an eye on. The European Union announced a $500 billion program, 500 billion with a B, around hydrogen over the next 10 years. This is real big money in a rapid time frame to build a hydrogen backbone, because there's a lot of need for heat in Europe from the cold winters, but also for industrial uses. And if we can replace the natural gas that's used for that heat today with hydrogen, the difference being hydrogen does not have carbon, and therefore when you burn the hydrogen, you don't get carbon dioxide, you avoid the greenhouse gases, but you still get the heat. So if you can replace the natural gas, which does have carbon, which does produce CO2, with hydrogen, which gives you the heat without the CO2, that can be really useful. And there's a lot of interest in that for Europe, which takes heat seriously and takes climate change seriously. And so I think there's some big investments there. The country of Japan's very serious about hydrogen, because Japan was really going to go towards the plutonium economy, the nuclear economy, until Fukushima happened about a decade ago. So now they're looking at the hydrogen economy, and Japan cares because they are not a country that produces their own oil, gas, and coal. Therefore, they import a lot of energy, and they want to find other ways to either make energy domestically. For example, you can fabricate hydrogen from water and other sources, or import it with a more variety of who the suppliers are for national security reasons. So it looks at Japan and the EU for leadership. Interestingly, the United States was a leader on hydrogen back in 2003. President Bush gave a speech at the State of the Union where he said a child born today being 2003, their first car they might drive 16 years later in 2019, a year ago, might be a hydrogen car. So the United States was a big leader on hydrogen, but we stepped back on that. Europe and Japan has stepped forward. Anyway, it's internationally relevant. It's a very interesting set of technologies. It's very hard. There are a lot of challenges with hydrogen, but there's some real money coming that direction. So we should certainly keep our eye on it.
So, yes, to everything that Michael said, and to the question on is what's going on at UT, please search H2 at UT. There's a website that puts together all the hydrogen research and hydrogen researchers that are doing work in hydrogen at UT. I'll give you a concrete example of what's happening. It's a DOE project that just started this summer. It's looking at multiple different ways of generating hydrogen and multiple different ways of using hydrogen in an actual pilot project that is happening on UT's West Research Campus, the Pickle Research Campus. And essentially, it's using wind and solar to generate hydrogen. It's using landfill, methane from landfill to generate hydrogen. and then using that hydrogen to power a stationary fuel cell that powers part of our advanced computing center, as well as powering several hydrogen fuel cell vehicles that Toyota is giving to us. So it's really a partnership between the university, but then also many different companies. It's a 3-year, $12 million project, again, to actually demonstrate this multiple streams of production and generation on site. And part B of that project is looking at the Port of Houston. And just as Michael mentioned, this real emphasis and interest in Europe, now that is starting to obviously trickle down, and players and actors in Texas and across the Gulf Coast here are getting very interested and active. And so the Port of Houston part of this project is looking at developing a plan by bringing together all the stakeholders and seeing, as we look at hydrogen generation infrastructure pipelines to move it, and as Michael mentioned, using in the industry and trucking, but then also for industrial uses, how do we go about in a coordinated fashion to make that happen from a policy perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and a technology perspective. So it's really active. UT is doing a lot, and that's a huge area of interest for us, where we are investing a lot.
There was a follow-up to that question, which was taking us in a different direction, and had to do with the fact that Texas produces a lot of computers and just technology that is that you essentially throw away. And that has a negative impact on the environment. And I was wondering if any of you could talk about what UT Austin, the type of research that UT Austin is doing about the effects of technology that is being thrown away, as in devices, tech devices, and so forth, and their harmful impact on the environment. Varun, you may know something about a faculty member or a group of faculty members that conduct research on this.
Yeah, that's a great question, Sonia. And I'll take a step back first to acknowledge that it is a very important question, right? One of the things, we hear is, let's just do this, and let's just, go all solar and go all storage and all X and Y. And that's all great. We really need to do that. At the same time, we need to do it in a way that doesn't address one problem and create all sorts of other problems. And that's a reality. It is totally possible. And that's the reason, if you look, for example, look at storage technologies, a lot of the batteries that are produced, and especially over the last decade or so, and also current technologies that they remain in production, they do use materials that are really at the scales that we're talking about in transportation. That's not the best way to go. But the good news is that there are researchers and technologies that are already designing and devising and starting to produce technologies that address and mitigate those types of issues, right? And so one faculty obviously comes to mind here at UT is Ram Mantiram, who is in the mechanical engineering, is in material sciences, and his group is devising new batteries that do not use environmentally harmful elements, right, and materials, right? And that's just one example. There are other colleagues in chemical engineering who are doing similar things in terms of producing new solar cells. And one of our colleagues, also actually in mechanical engineering, produced a new generation of solar materials called solar gels that have very amazing properties and are able to open new completely new ways of doing water purification in a way that was not possible before. So but I think the bigger question really is, can we just close our eyes and just go full speed with the types of technologies and production lines that we have? The answer to that is no. We need to acknowledge, address. We at UT are very mindful of the importance of that. Luckily, some agencies, including some programs that the Department of Energy has, also NSF and others, are also helping keep our eyes and help us drive in that direction. So it's a really important question. We don't want to be 3 decades down the line with lots of solar, wind, and storage, and have created parallel to the global warming problem.
Thank you. We have one question that's quite a little bit unrelated, but we touched upon it a little bit. It has to do with carbon capture and sequestration. Jorge Plaza wants to know what you think about it, what you think of it. That for a while it wasn't moving forward because of cost, and but it's back, especially in Norway and in the UK. Do you think that it will be a driver in the US and in Texas? Will there be considerable, where there's still considerable coal firing capacity?
From a geothermal perspective, yes, it's super complementary. And so if we're going, it's expensive and it requires a lot of energy, right? So those are the two barriers. And when you're requiring a lot of energy, you have to figure out where that's going to come from. And so there's this search for both in hydrogen and in sequestration, a clean 24/7 form of energy to power, these things. So you can make hydrogen and you can carbon sequester, right? And so a lot of the conversation around geothermal is using geothermal 24/7 for direct air capture of carbon, right? And then leveraging the oil and gas industry and its expertise to store the carbon underground. So it's one of the conversations that's progressing on the geothermal front, because geothermal is clean and it's available 24/7. It would be able to do hydrogen and carbon sequestration both together. So it's definitely in the conversation for the geothermal realm.
Thank you. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Geovision program?
So Geovision is a report that was recently published by the Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Energy. It was largely seen as an update to a report that was published in 2006 by MIT called The Future of Geothermal Energy. Both of the reports are good. The MIT report, the 2006 report, I actually regard as completely relevant still and visionary. And but it happened before the frac boom. It happened before a lot of these really enabling technologies. So while it was very visionary, it didn't have a really easy roadmap because the technology wasn't there. The Geovision is kind of an update to that, trying to figure out where the low-hanging fruit is for geothermal development in the U.S. And it's a U.S. focused report. So it focused largely on two types of geothermal, and one of them is called engineered geothermal systems. So it's an interesting report. It's something to check out. I would say, and I'll just be fully honest about this, the oil and gas industry is taking a different view largely from Geovision. So there is a divergence of opinion that's coming to the fore about the scale of the opportunity and how quickly it can be realized. Geovision speaks in terms of gigawatts by 2050, while it's become pretty normal to hear oil and gas folks talk about terawatts. So orders of magnitude and difference in terms of opinion about how quickly geothermal can become relevant globally and how big the potential is. Thank you.
We have a question from Adrian Wilbert, and I think it's to Michael. And Adrian wants to know if you foresee any major public or private investments, the way that similar to the one you talked about with hydrogen earlier, but to follow up on geothermal. In other words, a similar type of investment approach for geothermal.
I think geothermal warrants that kind of investment, large scale, because what geothermal has, I think Jamie said this earlier, is geothermal is universal. You just might have to drill to different depths to get it, but it exists everywhere, which isn't quite something that's true of solar and wind. Wind and solar are not really available everywhere quite as readily as geothermal might be if we develop the technologies. So geothermal warrants a bigger investment. I have not heard of any such large scale investment, though, and I think it's for the reasons Jamie mentioned, which is it just hasn't positioned itself in as organized a fashion or with the lobbying. And there are also places like in Europe where historically they focused on efficiency rather than new supply. And when they are looking at new supply, they're looking at hydrogen, not geothermal. So I think that's been part of the challenge. The United States has an opportunity here to lead because we have a lot of the drilling capabilities and we have an abundant geothermal resource, and we're behind on the other things. We might as well take the lead on something. So we will do that with geothermal. We tend not to do the same kind of industrial policy or large scale investments, but we do fund R&D. We do make it easy to do business in the United States. We do have a new presidential administration that's looking for shovel ready stimulus projects as they had in 2009. There might be an opportunity. And I think especially in California and Texas, some of these places where the resource is abundant and closer to the surface or leverages other capabilities. So this is my long way of saying, no, I don't see anything quite like the 500 billion for hydrogen going into geothermal anytime soon. That doesn't mean it shouldn't, or it doesn't mean it couldn't, but we'll have to get a little bit better organized to make that happen.
Sonia, if I might, I want to go back a little bit to the CCS question.
Sure.
Yeah, so, one thing, the way I look at CCS is from the other side of the equation. A lot of our conversation today has focused, let's say, for example, on solar and wind and storage and how their costs have come down and what that is doing. And that's great. That gets us quite a far along the way, right? But when you talk about complete net zero, right? The last 10, 20% can be very expensive, even with these technologies, when you consider seasonal variations and whatnot. And that's the way. From the other side of it is where I really think CCS becomes very important, right? Can you do at scale, CCS at scale in a way, you can still, and also very relevant for Texas, can you continue to use natural gas at scale and then combine that with CCS? So, from a cost perspective, while it may be expensive, by the time you are in the last 10, 20% of reducing emissions, everything is very expensive, right? And getting to scale. One thing that we have not talked about also becomes very relevant is we are, the scale and rapidity that is needed to build solar, wind, transmission lines, storage, that's, in very few times in the history of humanity, we have seen that scale. It's not going to be obvious. We need to do it, right? Of course, we need to do it, but it's not going to be obvious. There are going to be all sorts of, local consideration, local concern, right? In building infrastructure of any kind, including of increasingly opposition against solar and wind and transmission line infrastructure. So, while we can certainly do that, we also, from a societal and policy perspective, need to have our toolbox diverse and ready just in case we reach timing as well as scale related difficulties, and becomes, as I mentioned, especially relevant for Texas. And so, because of cost, because of infrastructure, and because of technological options, I think CCS still continues to be very relevant and important. It will be at least another 10, 15 years before we call that the time is over for CCS. But I've written and spoken for quite some time about CCS, saying CCS, it's time now. Let's just go in and try to figure it out. And the next 10 years are going to be extremely critical. They were very important last 10 years, and if we don't come around and figure out CCS from a cost and scale perspective in this decade, that's it.
Thank you. I have a question that's a little bit unrelated, and it has to do with cyber attacks. And because, Michael, you're working for a very large, I'd call it a conglomerate, a corporation that's all over the world, and that's, you were talking about the plants all over the world. What are some of the steps that are not only our researchers, but corporations such as ENGIE taking to ensure safety when it comes to cyber attacks of, for example, the electric grids in specific areas of the world?
The risk of cyber attacks is real. It is happening every day. The number of times cyber attacks happen every day would really blow your mind, but it's something like hundreds of thousands of times per day, depending on where you are, and it could be much more. So it is something that happens, and utilities know this with the electric grid. They have to harden the grid to make it less vulnerable to those attacks, but so does the gas grid, and so do oil and gas operators, and so do airlines, and so do the banks and everybody. So it's a real threat. It's a real concern. And ENGIE invests money in cybersecurity operations and also in the research to develop new tools. And we're also part of the different coalitions in Europe and elsewhere where they set the standards for cybersecurity. We're a part of the standard setting for industry. So we think about this a lot. Let me step back and give an example though from Austin, because I was on the Electric Utility Commission for 5 years in Austin. And the electric utility commission is like the regulators, the people who set the policy and run the utility from an oversight and governance perspective. And I asked a question about cybersecurity at one of our public commissioner meetings, and the utility's like, can we talk about this in private section? We want to talk about this in public. And I said, okay, sure. And the question I asked is like, why do you want to talk about this in public? They said, it's very difficult to talk about cybersecurity in public, because if you say the truth about what the risks are and how often attacks are occurring, it causes panic and makes people freak out. And if you say, oh, it's no big deal, we got it under control, it just taunts the hackers and makes them try harder. And so we don't really like to talk about it in public, and we don't have good focus groups that have figured out the words. It reminds me a little bit of pilots on an airplane. When they're about to hit turbulence, they have a responsibility to let you know there's going to be turbulence, and therefore the risks of the flight are going to go up a little bit. But they don't want to freak you out and make you panic, but they do want you to put on your seatbelt. And so you'll hear them say in a very calm voice, we have a little bit of chop coming up or some rocky air, and we just advise you to take your seat and plug in your seatbelt. And their voice is very calm. And they really don't want you to panic, but they really want you to put your seatbelt on. And we haven't figured out the tone of voice to use for cybersecurity, but I will say I have flown on many different airlines, and every pilot uses the exact same phrasing. They know exactly what to say and how to do it to warn us of the risk without making us panic. That's where we need to get with cybersecurity. We're not there. Two more quick comments. I know I'm taking too much time. Most of the power plants in the United States are not connected to the internet. They are not connected. And that is because of the risk of cybersecurity. And so it's hard to turn off a power plant with it by a hacker. However, the grid is connected, and certainly our appliances, our smartphones, and smart computers, and our refrigerators and microwaves are now connected. So there's many points of entry for hackers, but it's not the power plants themselves usually. So that's one thing. In other countries, the power plants sometimes are connected. And there was a dam, I want to say about a decade ago in Paraguay, that was turned off by hackers. And the government and the facility operators had to turn it back on. And there were rumors that it was a cyber attack. And the government said, no, it was not a cyber attack. It was just a standard maintenance thing. We turned it off for a day to do maintenance. We guarantee it wasn't a hacker attack, that kind of thing. And the hackers got mad, so they turned it off again the next day. So you're dealing with people for whom this is sometimes a sport. It's not really done to get money or cause problems, but just sort of have fun. And so we have to think about that. Anyway, it's a very bizarre world, but cybersecurity risks are absolutely real, something that we think about and every other company thinks about every day.
Thank you. We have a question from Luis Macias Chapa. He's wanting to know about the main environmental drawbacks of solar and wind energy.
I could talk about this, I'm sure Varun can too. So the most typical, so if you look at wind and solar, the single biggest drawback from an environmental perspective is the fact that they are diffuse, that they are not very dense. The benefit of fossil fuels like oil and gas and coal is that they are very dense. Because wind and solar are diffuse, not dense, it requires a lot of land. And so the land impacts tend to be the biggest impact. The number of acres you need per megawatt of capacity, for example, is quite high for wind and solar compared to nuclear or coal. Now, you can use that land for other things like agriculture or whatever. Or if it's on a building with solar, you can use the solar, the rooftop for photons and below for living. So you might get dual use out of the land, but it's very land intensive. That's the primary environmental impact. And if you're talking about a lot of acreage, a lot of land in sensitive habitats where there might be the desert tortoise or the prairie chicken or other things, you have to worry about that. And this could also include impacts on birds and bats in the case of wind. So the land impacts and therefore the animal impacts are non-trivial and serious. That's the biggest impact. You also have to worry about the materials, the mining to get the materials to manufacture the solar panels and the wind turbines, or the disposal of those materials when they're done. So those are also land impacts from the mining and from the disposal. You don't have the air quality impacts from the pollution or the carbon dioxide, and you don't have the water impacts for the most part because they don't need water for processes or for cooling, except in a few very particular types of concentrating solar power that might use some water to make steam. So the impacts are really land impacts. They avoid a lot of the climate change and air quality and water use or water quality impacts you might have with other forms of energy.
The only other thing I'll add to that is in terms of security of supply chains. So something COVID-19 has taught us is, again, it's just, we had known it, but we got reminded in a big way how interconnected supply chains, while help us in many ways, can also create new dependencies and can really shatter a lot of our way of life quickly. And that is also the case with many of the materials that get used in these technologies, solar, and then in particular, China is very, very important in this supply chain. A lot of the materials that get produced, China has really a very strong hold in terms of those parts of the supply chain. And so it depending on which country it is, it becomes important then if a part of the plan is to really scale up wind, solar, storage, as well as have it as part of rejuvenation of your own economy, right? Then how do you figure that out? What types of new technologies, new supply chains, infrastructure you create to basically both reduce the direct environmental impacts of some of these materials, which are very real. So you don't want to do that, but then also really position yourself to minimize the security aspects, national security aspects of the supply chain.
Thank you. One of the most, I think, frustrating things about these Texas global dialogues is that they end and we don't have the opportunity to pick your brains and to really dig deeper in terms of the expertise that you have. We have a final question before we end the day. Coming from Elizabeth Carey, and it has to do with electric vehicles. And I think many of us think about that as consumers. Are electric vehicles really green in terms of the technology that they utilize when you're considering the costs and the externalities and things of the sort? Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah, so no opinion, just research. The data are very clear that electric vehicles are cleaner end to end, even compared to efficient diesel, especially as the power sector cleans up. So most cars, gasoline diesel cars, get dirtier over their 10 to 15-year lifetime as the cars become less efficient. Electric cars become cleaner over their 10 to 15-year lifetime because they're plugged into a grid that is getting cleaner with time. So that's one key point. They're already cleaner, but they get cleaner with time. The second thing to keep in mind is whether we like electric vehicles as a cleaner solution or not, the automotive manufacturers have decided for us that what we're going to buy in the future is going to be electric vehicles. Certain companies like Volkswagen have pledged $35 billion to $80 billion on R&D and retooling so that their factories will make electric vehicles, and we'll have dozens of options of electric vehicles from Volkswagen alone. They are ending their research program on diesel and gasoline combustion. That means if you buy a Volkswagen, it will be an electric vehicle. The manufacturers, and they're not the only ones, others do the same. The manufacturers are choosing for us because those cars end up being cheaper to maintain, easier to build, cleaner. Plus, there are mandates or requirements at the city level in different cities, including Paris and countries like Norway, that either have banned combustion engines or are giving incentives for electric vehicles. So we're headed that way regardless, and they are cleaner. So this is the right direction from an environmental perspective.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, I think this brings us to a close. This Texas Global Dialogue was the last one of the fall. We will have more dialogues in the spring semester, and as soon as travel resumes in a more robust way, we will see you in one of the countries that you're representing. We think of you as our global ambassadors representing the University of Texas at Austin all over the world. We want to have a very close engagement with you and expand that engagement, and we're looking forward to that. So I want to thank all of our alumni for being here with us, but more importantly, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers this morning or evening or afternoon, wherever you're all located, for taking the time to speak to us, to share with us their experience, and also to share knowledge about what is happening in terms of research and development and research specifically at UT Austin. I think that this is a very fertile ground for advancement, and we're looking forward to sharing more with you as the months and years go. I hope that you will have taken the information of our speakers, and we will make sure that you are connected should you wish to be connected for more information, specifically about geothermal or about the Cockrell School or the LBJ School and the ENGIE Institute. So I want to thank all of you for being with us today. For all registered participants, please know that we will send you a link, an email, and there will be a recording and a brief survey. We would like to know what topics are of interest to all of you so that we can deliver very informed Texas Global Dialogues. And that's, I think, the end of our meeting together today. And I want to thank again all of you for attending a wonderful session and wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.